Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you can join us. This week's episode of Brussels Sprouts picks up in the aftermath of the Munich Security Conference. The U.S. tone at Munich was notably more conciliatory as U.S. officials sought to calm anxieties. Secretary of State Marco Rubio received a standing ovation as he called European allies America's oldest friends and cited the history of mutual defense from Korea to Afghanistan. But for many Europeans, the rhetoric did little to dispel deeper doubts about the trajectory of the transatlantic relationship. Meanwhile, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was also at Munich, stepping onto the main stage against the backdrop of transatlantic strain. Yi used his presence in Munich to position China as a responsible global actor, a stabilizing force in a fragmented world. And notably, the sharp European rhetoric towards Beijing that defined previous conferences was more muted. As tensions with Washington have mounted, several European leaders, including Canada's Mark Carney and Britain's Keir Starmer, have also traveled to Beijing. Indeed, geopolitical currents in both Europe and the Indo-Pacific are rapidly changing, and there's no one better to talk about these developments than a former ambassador to both China and NATO, Ambassador Nick Burns. Ambassador Burns, welcome to Brussels Sprouts.
Andrea and Jim, thanks so much. I'm a first-time caller, first time on your show, but a long admirer.
Well, thank you for that. And I'll just do a little bit more of an introduction. So Ambassador Burns is a professor of diplomacy and international relations at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Previously, he was a career Foreign Service officer and served, as I said, as U.S. Ambassador to China from 2021 to 2025 and as Ambassador to NATO from 2001 to 2005. Now, we're going to break with Brussels Sprouts precedent, where I usually hog the beginning of the conversation, and because Jim has been so excited to have you on, Nick. So I'm going to turn the floor immediately over to Jim, who's going to ask what I hope is a very poignant and insightful question.
Well, Andrea, thank you very much. I'm having had that kind of introduction. I'm freaking out a little bit. I forgot what my question was now. So thank you for setting me up. No, Andrea, thank you. I'm happy to do this. And Nick, thank you so much for appearing with us. For all of our Brussels Sprouts listeners, one thing that Andrea left out of her introduction is that Nick was my boss at U.S. Mission NATO, and we were there during 9/11. And let me tell you, Nick Burns had a cool hand at the tiller there at U.S. Mission as we were going through the same kind of stress as was happening in Washington. And we all needed leadership, and particularly at the mission when there was a lot of nervous people there at the U.S. Mission. And Nick really took us through some very dark times. So, Nick, it's great to see you and to relive those days a little bit. But I want to take us in a different direction, though. I've been, you and I and a lot of our colleagues have spent a lot of our lifetime working this transatlantic relationship, nurturing it in the garden, if you will, for years on end. For me, it's been about 2 decades or more, just nothing but NATO and Europe. And so, as all of this is happening, and we know the context on why, we know the why. We're familiar with the emotion on both sides of the Atlantic on these kinds of issues. We've heard past administrations say some very similar things as we've hearing out of Donald Trump. And we've all been trying to deal with those issues that have been raised by President Trump. So, but at the same time, the medicine seems to be really harming the patient, if you will. And so I wanted to ask you, just from the 60,000 foot level, how do you look on this? I mean, as a historic phenomena, you could look on it, a lot of different ways, but how do you keep this in your mind? How do you deal with this in your mind as the events unfold and we watch it every day?
Well, Jim and Andrea, I started in the U.S. government as probably the lowest ranking person in the government as an intern in the Commerce Department in 1979, then in Mauritania in 1980. And in all that time, I've always been reminded of 3 things. Europe's our largest trading partner. Europe's our largest investor in our economy, and the greatest collection and most important collection of American allies in the world are in Europe and Canada. And we can always depend on those allies. So am I disappointed? Yes, of course. As a former ambassador to NATO, I'm disappointed that the United States is in a way, we're seeing broken trust between Canada and the United States, Europe and the United States. And, we can talk about some of the things that the Trump administration has done well, and they deserve some credit. They certainly, I think President Trump's been able to get the Europeans to spend, and the Canadians spend more on defense, 3.5 and 1.5. We didn't have similar success. I grant them that. But I still think that most Americans understand that NATO is vital for us, that Canada is just about the best neighbor that anyone would even want to invent for a country like ours. And I live up in Boston, and we camped in Canada with my dad and my mom and dad and my brothers 6 consecutive years when I was a kid. Have great respect for the Canadians. And so I have this faith that when the pendulum swings to a Republican president after 2028 or a Democratic president, just knowing the American people, looking at the polls, knowing how members of Congress in both parties feel, we're not going to desert NATO. And at some point, we'll go back to a full embrace of NATO because it's in our interest. And I think if we remember that fundamentally, we're going to be okay. I'm not trying to minimize the problem. I think if you look at the great schisms in the North Atlantic Alliance since 1949, Suez is certainly one. In 1956, Jim and I, you and I lived through another one. When we went into Iraq in March 2003, it split the alliance. And France and Germany and Belgium and Luxembourg said no for a while until they came along. And this is another schism. This is profound, though. When the President of the United States threatens to attack a NATO ally, Denmark, in Greenland, when he questions the sovereignty of Denmark in Greenland or Canada, then we are in uncharted waters. We've never had a president do that since Harry Truman established NATO with the others in 1949. So we've got a lot of work to do. I think reminding here at home the American people, this is not charity to be part of NATO. And for those listening, Jim Townsend and I lived through 9/11 and September 12th together. The terror, I think, that we all felt when the Twin Towers came down, when Flight 93 crashed in Pennsylvania, when the Pentagon was attacked, the uncertainty, when was the next attack coming? Are we alone? And then David Wright, the Canadian ambassador, maybe 3 hours after the attack, called me, Jim, in my office at NATO headquarters. He said, "Nick, we're with you, Canada." I find this supremely ironic these days. He said, "Have you thought about invoking Article 5? He was the very first one. That was the very first country. And I've never forgotten what Canada did for us and what the Allies did. So, yes, I'm disappointed in the state of affairs in the North Atlantic Alliance. But I'm reminded that the United States cannot be successful in the world without those allies. And I signed a letter with the other former American ambassadors to NATO and the former Supreme Allies commanders of NATO, all Americans, a long, deep, we felt detailed statement that didn't criticize anyone in the administration or the administration itself. It just said, here is why the North Atlantic Alliance is vital to the United States. It's existentially vital for us. So I have an abiding faith we will swing back towards reason and a full embrace of our allies.
Thank you very much. I'll be able to sleep tonight. You've given me enough hope to make it through the rest of the day. Thank you very much. Andrea, I hand the microphone back to you.
I'll push back just a little bit, not against anything that you said, but on this concept that the United States will be back, that that we will return to a warmer embrace of NATO. I think that's the thing that is giving a lot of our European allies, rightfully, a lot of anxiety that, you'll hear. I mean, I know you hear all of these things all the time from your European counterparts and colleagues and friends. But, with the election of Donald Trump, it was a difficult 4 years. and they were willing to muddle through. And then we get to Joe Biden and everyone breathes a sigh of relief. But when the US reelects Trump for a second time, and now given everything that you outlined, has happened, they're less willing to accept that the United States will be back. And so when now we have this general consensus, I feel like in the transatlantic community, that there's no going back. We're not going back to the way that things were. So when you say like the embrace, talk to us a little more about how you envision this relationship evolving into the future.
Well, Andrea, thank you. And thank you for your question and your clarification. I don't mean to say we're not in a terrible situation. We're in a terrible situation. And I think, frankly, just even beyond where we were in Suez in 1956, because it's not just a major policy difference. That's what Suez was all about. It's about trust. And our whole alliance has been built on trust, that we have each other's back, that we're not trying to change each other's societies, that we're not trying to hold Europe to a standard that we don't hold Russia and China to. I'm talking about Secretary Rubio's speech, Vice President Vance's speech a year ago, where suddenly we have become a critic of the immigration policies, the climate policies of Europe, the free speech policies, when we all know German history and how the German government doesn't want hate speech, i.e. pro-Nazi speech, in Germany itself. And so, I thought that Secretary Rubio's speech was respectful. I liked part of it. I liked the fact that he obviously wanted to send a message of unity and of support. And yet in that speech, no criticism whatsoever of Vladimir Putin, no support to Ukraine. Ukraine didn't even appear in the speech. No criticism. And Wang Yi was speaking right after Secretary Rubio of China's major human rights violations, of Chinese aggression towards the Philippines, Vietnam, Republic of Korea, Taiwan, India, of the fact that China represents a system of government that is alien to the United States. So I worry about a double standard here. We're holding Europe to a different standard, i.e. more demanding. We're much more critical of Europe than we are of Russia and China. I was severely disappointed in that. When I say that the United States should re-embrace our allies, I mean that. We need to embrace our allies and be fully with them, especially on Ukraine, especially in facing the existential threat that if Russia emerges from a ceasefire agreement or a peace agreement eventually as the winner in this war, and if we ask Ukraine to make compromises that we're not asking the Russians to make, I think that is going to work against the vital interests of the United States. It's why we have to return to an embrace of NATO. And last point I'd make, Andrea, would be to say, when I was in China for 3 years, I found at every turn the Europeans were with us, and they helped us to contain Chinese power, whether it was the EU and the US jointly criticizing the discriminatory treatment of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, or what was going on in Tibet, or Chinese expansionism and aggressive behavior in the Spratly and Paracel Islands and the Senkaku of the South China Sea, Senkakus of the East China Sea. And I know that this greatly worried the Chinese, that Ursula von der Leyen and Joe Biden were partners on China policy. And so we need the Europeans to face down Putin and Russian expansionism in Europe and to face down the Chinese. So this is a vital interest for us, and I think any kind of reasonable president in the future of either party is going to come to this conclusion, which is why I think, no, it won't be exactly the way it was on January 20th of 2025, the way we left it, but we can do this. And I think that's the commitment we have to make to ourselves and to our European allies.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. Lots of different ways. You just put a lot on the table. So maybe let's just stick with Munich for 1 second. What was your sense of the mood? Again, a lot of divided opinions on the Rubio speech. Some people, in the room people have talked about the standing ovation and maybe a sense of relief. But a lot of the anxiety still heard in the halls. And I wonder, did you pick up on that kind of dichotomy as well? Like, what, I guess, talk to us a little bit about some of your key takeaways from Munich this year.
Well, I got to tell you, I was signed up to go to Munich, all ready to go, but I'm writing a book on U.S.-China relations. I'm behind and I have deadlines. So I decided I didn't go to Munich.
Well, Jim and I didn't go either.
I
So,
spent 5 days writing the book, but I really paid attention. So
yeah.
here's what I thought from the sidelines. I credit Secretary Rubio for understanding that the largely supportive and friendly message he gave had to be given after last year's speech and after everything that's happened on Greenland and Canada especially. Number one, I thought that in many ways he was reassuring, and I'm sure that was sincere on his part. What I thought was a major missed opportunity was not to be much more critical of the Chinese and Russians than he was of the Europeans. And also, when he defined Western civilization as largely Christian, that is a problem for the United States and Europe. We are both multiracial societies and multi-ethnic societies and multi-religious societies. And we have to have a sense of the melting pot both in the European Union, and the Europeans do, as we do. And I thought that was not just a missed opportunity, that was a major mistake to think that somehow we're going to go back to 200 years ago. And almost there was a sense of holding up colonialism in that era as the example of when we were once great. No, we've been at our greatest when we've treated people well, no matter what their religion and ethnicity and race are. And I think the European Union has struggled with that issue. The United States has struggled. But to define it as Christian, and I'm a Christian, and I'm Catholic, and proud to be, but I know that we have to be not just open, but fully embracing other ethnicities and religions. And then I thought the second thing that was really off-key was going to Hungary and Slovakia.
Right.
Two countries close to Putin, two countries not with the European mainstream, and certainly two countries, in my judgment, that don't really support the United States in the way that they should. So in that sense, I was bothered by it. I credit him for what he did well, but I think there were serious parts of that speech seriously off-key.
Thanks for that. I'm with you. Particularly there was no talk about values and this type of thing. And then sometimes, writing talking points not just for you but also for the lots of secretaries of defense as they went to Munich. We put in boilerplate that we consider boilerplate, and I even got pushback from some SecDef saying, "You're always talking about values. You're always talking about the 2%. Can't we say something new?" And I understood that, but now I know what it sounds like when you don't talk about values. When you talk about something else, it really begins to ring hollow. And so I agree with your point very, very much. And values is something that was left out as well. But my question though is, one thing that in terms of looking at the future and the pendulum swinging back, because I think I'm hoping that we'll have like you said, a pendulum swinging back. I'm hoping that it'll be something resembling what we've known in the past that is part of a strong transatlantic relationship. But one thing that I think is going to be a little bit different too, and I want to get your take, and that is it's going to be different in Europe in the sense that they are racing pell-mell in a way that I never thought I would see, quite frankly. And we used to push back on these feelings that they would have about strategic autonomy and all the stuff that we used to have to argue with France about, particularly. Now it is the flavor of the month. That is where they're going, and so by the time the pendulum begins to move, and we might begin to have a semblance of the relationship back, it's going to be a different Europe, I think. Not just up here in their mind and then and how they might regard us, but I think they're going to have some structures. Certainly within NATO, that'll be different. NATO will be steered more by Europe than by the United States. Understand that. And we've already started that in the command structure, as you know. We've shifted some things so that the Italians and the Brits are now in the higher up in the command structure. We're going to be pulling back some of our military that are in the international military staff and out of shape, and so So there's changes afoot, and I think we're going to see maybe even outside NATO, some coalitions of the willing, or other aspects of a European approach to really putting into practice strategic autonomy. And so I'm wondering if what you think about that. I mean, I'm of two minds. I mean, uh, I think we can only this is only right if they're going to be putting a lot of money back into defense and organizing themselves. It's only right that they also have more say about things. I'm a little nervous about it being outside of NATO, but as you think about where Europe is going, where Europe might be when that pendulum swings, what are you seeing and what do you think about it?
Jim, I welcome this. You and I remember 9/11 was 25 years ago. We had big struggles, theological, with the French especially, the Belgians, sometimes the Germans under the SPD governments,
The
about
Chocolate Summit. Remember the Chocolate
The
Summit?
Chocolate Summit,
Yeah,
European security, defense identity, defense policy going our own way. We worried about that would split NATO. But that was a quarter of a century ago. And where I think President Trump and Secretary Rubio are right is that they are pushing the Europeans to hold up more of the burden. And frankly, that's fair. Europe should. It's good to see Chancellor Merz and President Macron and Prime Minister Starmer leading the effort to strengthen Europe's military, uh, to boost Europe's military strength. Why do I say that? Two reasons. One is we've got to face down Putin. He's only turning 73 this year. And if he's president for life, and I think he thinks of himself that way, and let's say he lives into his 80s, he is seeking to undo everything that was accomplished between 1989 and 1991. You remember what H.W. Bush used to say? Europe whole, free, and at peace. Those
right.
three words that Europe had not ever been in history. It was a magical achievement of the European peoples to liberate themselves from the USSR and the Warsaw Pact. And we cannot let Putin redivide Europe along authoritarian lines in the East, especially. And I tell you, I'm one of those people who believes if he gets away with his crime in Ukraine, what's going to prevent him, maybe after a year or two of retooling a 1.5 million person Russian army, to go into Latvia and Estonia, where they're 30% of the populations are ethnic Russians?
Right.
Where you and I have been up to the Narva River, separating Estonia from Russia itself. How about Romania and even Poland? He's messianic. He has made mistake after mistake. Nobody felt he would invade Ukraine, or very few people did, say 6 months before he did. And so we have got to have a European strength in order to contain Russian power. We're back to containment. And the second reason is we need Europe to be with us in the bigger problem, perhaps in the next 20 to 30 years. It's the authoritarian alliance, Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, but it's an expansion of Chinese power. It's the self-confidence of Xi Jinping, another 72-year-old, turning 73 this year. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I'm 70, so I can kind of put myself into their shoes. They're in legacy mode. Putin's great obsession is subsume Ukraine into a Slavic, stronger, Russian-led order. And Xi Jinping's great obsession is, Macau's back, Hong Kong's back, China's strong. We need Taiwan back into the fold. We've got to contain Chinese power. And boy, were the Europeans helpful. And with us, let me credit Ambassador Jorge Toledo, who was the EU ambassador to China when I was there. We weren't just personal friends. We were arm in arm on battle after battle with the Chinese. We both sanctioned the EU and the United States. Hundreds of Chinese firms that were shipping the microelectronics to fuel the Russian war machine. We were together on human rights issues. We were together on Taiwan. We were together to help the Philippines withstand this PLA intimidation in the West Philippine Sea. I knew when I went out to China that, Japan was our rock solid ally, that South Korea would be with us. The Australians, always strong and true. What really surprised me, and I'm a Europeanist, spent a lot of my career in Europe, the degree to which Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission, and many of the member governments had steel backbones when it came to China. So boy, do we need to get this transatlantic relationship back in shape. Because we're fighting, we don't want to fight. We are going to resist, hopefully, on an existential basis, Putin and Xi Jinping, I think, for the next decade. So
Yeah.
we've got to come back
Yeah.
to a stronger NATO. And if Europe's stronger, and if Europe has a sense of itself, and Europe wants to even lead on part of this, old people, well, certainly old NATO nicks like you and I should welcome that, I
Yeah.
think.
I agree. I
But
agree
that's not,
completely.
but that's not where we are. That is definitely the vision, Nick, and it has changed so much. I was thinking back to previous Munich security conferences where a lot of the focus was how do we more closely align the United States and Europe on China, right? At the beginning of the Biden administration, it was a big push trying to bring Europe and coordinating and at least having complementary policies on China. We're so far away from that. And now, in my introduction, we talked about the Canadians, Carney making the trip to Beijing, UK's Keir Starmer making the trip, all against this backdrop of more tensions in the relationship. So from your view and having spent, 4 years as the US ambassador to Beijing, what's your sense of how Beijing is looking at this moment?
Oh, Andrea, the Chinese are trying to divide Europe from the United States. You saw that in Wang Yi's, I thought, very cynical performance. I watched the speech in Munich. And I don't think he took I don't think many Europeans bought what he was trying to sell that day. So, I think I am not overreacting to President Macron and Prime Minister Starmer and soon Chancellor Merz going to Beijing. Donald Trump's going to Beijing 5 weeks from now. All of us have big trading relationships with China. It's not unusual. If the American president can go, I don't see how we Americans can complain that European leaders are going. None of us wants to decouple our economic relationships with China. This is what makes our relationship with China so complicated. We want to live in a peaceful relationship. We want to trade because we think that actually probably helps us to maintain a peaceful relationship. And yet at the same time, they're our strongest competitor on 9 or 10 major issues. And I trust the Europeans not to be taken in by Chinese blandishments. Europeans are rock solid on Taiwan. They're rock solid on South and East China Sea. They're rock solid on human rights issues. In fact, here's another thing that was missing from Secretary Rubio's speech: human rights.
Right.
The Trump administration has been saying since the president's first trip to Saudi Arabia last winter, hey, we're not going to judge anybody on human rights. And I'll end on this, Andrea, but here's a logical inconsistency. So we are not criticizing Putin on his barbaric war in Ukraine, and we seem to be, leaning more towards his side of the negotiations than Zelensky's. We're not criticizing China anymore on human rights, but we become the leading critic of European democracy, European free speech, European hate speech laws. I find that not just, I'm struggling for the right words here because I want to be somewhat diplomatic and responsible. I find that bizarre, irresponsible, and untruthful.
Yeah.
Europeans are upholding democracy in every way. We should want to be aligned with them and not become their leading critic.
I'll add to something else that was absolutely unacceptable, just to state it on the table. And I do have a question for you, but the remark about the allies in Afghanistan, and you and I were there during Afghanistan, and that just tore my heart out hearing not just what he said, but the how it impacted the European allies. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to voice like I did. I was on CNN and they had just run this piece right before I was supposed to go on, laying out all the anger in Europe, and then they turned the camera on me and said, "What do you think?" And I just exploded. They were shocked. I'm surprised they ran the segment, but it's just, and I thought, so what did you make of that? And then I have a question for you.
I thought it was repulsive, and one of the worst things that an American president could say. One of the things that we did in NATO is we went down and visited. We would fly in C-17s from Brussels to Kabul, 2003, 4, 5, 6. And I remember going to Kandahar, and I remember the Canadian troops took major losses in Kandahar. That was a very difficult place to be during this. You remember the surge and the
Right.
increase in Taliban attacks on American and NATO forces. The Danes in Helmand province. I mean, the Europeans dove into the battle. And when President Trump said that in Davos, I watched the debate, particularly in the United Kingdom, over the following weekend. British widows
Yeah.
whose husbands, boyfriends, brothers, sisters, died in Afghanistan, furious on social media. How dare you criticize my dead husband? He was on the front lines, not the back lines. And I think that was a major miscalculation, and sometimes leadership means admitting you said something really foolish and even dangerous, and yet our president doesn't have that capacity.
Yep.
And I thought it was entirely damaging. And I admire so much the Danes. I watched on, I think, YouTube, these major, almost silent Danish protests outside the U.S. Embassy. That whole episode of planting the Danish flag in the planters in front of the embassy to represent the Danish losses per capita, the highest in the alliance. It was jarring. The American president should never, ever, ever think or say that. And this is where the binds of the trust has been broken. And we Americans need to help repair that trust.
And they removed the flags.
Yeah, unfortunately they did. You can't imagine that happening.
I know. Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, and I hope that we have a lot of allies. Actually, I think a lot of our Brussels sprouts listeners are in a lot of the European capitals, and so I hope they, your words mean something to them and will help them recover from this. I still get emails from Danish colleagues just so upset. But my question, and I know Andrea wants me to ask a question. My question is going back to China. There was an interesting article, I think it was in The Guardian or one of the British papers, talking about and criticizing the Starmer visit. And in a sense, mocking his visit because in their eyes, in the Guardian's eyes, they saw the Chinese mocking Starmer. There are a lot of slights that were, the Guardian kind of interpreted as this is a slight by the Chinese. They look on Starmer as weak. They're not paying attention to him the way they did other potentates who arrived in China. So my question for you is, what do you, with this rush to Beijing, Carney, of course, went very quickly, Starmer, Macron, we were just talking about the Europeans that had gone there. Do you think, does she just sit there and just shake his head and do you think he really does, in a sense, mock this kind of thing? He sees the Europeans running to Beijing, almost like supplicants in some ways. That's kind of how it can appear that way. Is that the way she is looking on it? Does he just shake his head and smile? Yeah, come on in. I'll give you 30 minutes, and then you need to go back to Europe. I'm busy. I mean, how does she look on this race to Beijing over the past few months?
Jim, as I said before, the Chinese have really been struck, and I think they were very surprised after February 24th, 2022, the degree to which their relationship with Europe really suffered. And it really suffered because China has been a military supporter, an indispensable military supporter, as you know, of Russia. And this is an existential issue, Ukraine, for the Europeans. And so the Chinese have been in the European doghouse for the last 4 years, and they should be. So I'd answer your question this way. I don't think we Americans can object to Europe maintaining strong commercial relations with China because we're trying to do the same thing. President Biden was, and President Trump is. But at the same time, I think Europe needs to hold the line and continue to sanction Chinese companies providing what we believe is 90% of the microelectronics support, which is critical to the Russian war machine, the Russian defense industrial base, that Europe needs to withhold a normal relationship with China because of what the Chinese are doing to support Vladimir Putin. And I think as long as that distinction's being made, that there's not a return to normal behavior, normal state-to-state relations, frankly, I think that would be the best place for Europe to be to defend its interests. And I would hope we don't see a softening of the American position on China, what I'm beginning to worry about is that we have basically a one-dimensional policy towards China now. It's being led by the Treasury Secretary, who's very capable, and that would be for President Trump to go to Beijing, have an agreement with President Xi to sustain the tariff truce since October and the supply chain truce, and kind of calm the waters economically. If that's part of what we want to accomplish, then I would support it. But if we're not going to raise human rights, if we're not going to put pressure on China and continue to sanction Chinese companies for supporting Russia in Ukraine, if we're letting down our guard and letting NVIDIA and AMD and Intel sell the H200 chip to China, that will help the PLA to compete with our military in the Indo-Pacific. I really worry that President Trump is going soft on China. And I pay a lot of attention to Republicans in Congress, the China Committee in the House, the leading Republican voices. There aren't many members of Congress who support this softening of approach on China. So when I read in the American press or even administration statements, we're worried that Prime Minister Carney, President Macron went to Beijing. Well, I'm worried about what's just about to happen 5 weeks from now. And that is an American policy that's significantly weaker towards China. I worry about us on this issue.
Yeah, I thought I saw on X, and I can't confirm, like that we just postponed the military package to Taiwan ahead of the trip. Is that?
Andrea, this is really concerning. You'll remember, Andrea, 'cause I know you pay a lot of attention to the political military side of things. The administration, quite rightly, announced 6 weeks ago, an $11 billion arms sales to Taiwan.
Yeah.
And now President Trump said the other day on Air Force One, well, I'm negotiating this. I'm discussing it with Xi Jinping. This is a little bit of theology, but it's very important. Under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, every administration must sell or provide defensive military technology to Taiwan for deterrence sake. And the law also says the United States must maintain sufficient military power in the region to ensure the peace. And President Reagan actually made 6 assurances in 1982 to strengthen that commitment. And assurances 1 and 2 say, we will not negotiate American arms sales to Taiwan with the People's Republic. We won't tell them in advance. We won't let them intimidate us. It looks like President Trump is being intimidated by President Xi Jinping to not go forward with the arms sale because President Trump doesn't want the summit to somehow not happen. And I just read the Wall Street Journal editorial this week saying this is extremely unwise. And you'll hear a lot of conservative voices saying that in the Republican Party as well as the Democratic Party.
So here's a question for you on how you're reading those voices, because I agree, a lot of Republicans don't approve of the softening, but many Republicans also don't approve of the soft position we've taken with Russia and the lack of support for Ukraine, and yet they're not really willing to pipe up in a meaningful way. Do you think on the issue of China that there would be more members of Congress who would be willing to take a stronger stance and push back on this administration's line, or are they still really kind of towing the line?
Well, I think, we've seen in the last several months, as you both know, more people stand up in the Republican Party and say, on this one, I support President Trump, but on this particular issue, I don't. And that is somewhat new. Frankly, I would have expected more Republicans to stand up on behalf of Ukraine publicly. And the way that we're conducting this negotiation, I do not believe that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner should be kind of independent mediators between the Russians and Ukraine. We should be Ukraine's lawyer and Ukraine's military backer. And the same holds true on China. We've succeeded in having a bipartisan consensus on China for about 10 years now. As President Biden's ambassador, I would tell the Chinese, when I'm criticizing you on Xinjiang, on the Uyghurs, or criticizing you in Taiwan, I would say, I have Republicans behind me in Congress who fully support what I'm saying to you, i.e. don't divide us. And I worry that this softening has gone too far. And I would expect substantial criticism of the administration by Republicans on this issue. Let's see what happens the next 5 weeks.
I guess as a final question, or a couple of questions, I mean, just to stay on the China piece for a moment. Talk to us about, I mean, you did a little bit, I mean, in terms of the way that perhaps Xi Jinping has been able to intimidate President Trump over Taiwan and other things. Talk to us about your read of how Beijing is navigating this administration. And I'll ask the very kind of cliched question on, does that change Xi's calculus on Taiwan? Would this be the moment, if he anticipates there wouldn't be more significant pushback, that he could take a more aggressive posture over reasserting Chinese control over Taiwan?
So, Andrea, the Chinese want to effectively have a G2 in the world, the United States and China. They want to weaken the U.S., the transatlantic relationship. They specifically want to weaken the U.S. alliance with Japan. When I was a very young officer, I flew out as a minor person on the plane with Secretary George Shultz in 1988. And we were flying in, it was my first time to Asia. We were flying into Tokyo, and he called us up to the front of the plane, which was President Kennedy's old 707. And he said, we're just about to fly into the capital of the most important ally in the world that we have, and that's Japan. This is 1988, before the pivot to Asia, before it was very clear that the Indo-Pacific was the primary area of national security for the United States. And I've always remembered that. And so here's how Japan comes into play right now. The Chinese are very worried about Prime Minister Takaichi. She's strong. She has a big mandate. The LDP may soon have a substantial majority in the Japanese Diet. She's appropriately tough. And what she said on Taiwan, that this, of course, would be an existential event for Japan, is absolutely true. And so I've been waiting for the administration to stand up with a ringing support for her, an endorsement of her, because what the Chinese want to do is push her into the background. And they want to present American policy as kind of China and the United States will decide these things. And that's not in the American national interest. So I hope President Trump won't fall for this very obvious ploy by the Chinese to have him, in a way, not be sufficiently supportive of Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, Australia, India as our strategic partner. I think that's very important that this happened at this time.
Well, this has been wonderful. A really excellent conversation. Jim, anything you want to throw in at the end? Do you have a good Jim Townsend question?
No, all of mine was front loaded. So this has just been fabulous. And Nick, do you miss it? Nick, do you miss it? Do you miss being in the? I kind of miss it. I do miss it a bit.
Well, I think the three of us, wanted to be in Teddy Roosevelt's arena of public service. Roosevelt said, the credit belongs to the man, we'll modernize him, and the woman who's in the arena, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, and even if he or she fails, at least they fail while daring greatly, so that their place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat.
Yeah.
So magical. And when I meet with my students here at Harvard Kennedy School, I say, look, if you want to make a difference in the world, you've got to go into that arena. So of course I miss it. We all do. But I just have this faith. Let's end on a positive, hopeful note that we're going to come out of this. It's going to take us a while. It may take us several years to understand we need Europe in the North Atlantic theater, but we need Europe in the Middle East with us. We need Europe in the Indo-Pacific with us. They are vital. And I think a rational assessment of American interests will lead us back to that conclusion.
Perfect. I think we're about 50-50 on when we can end on a positive note versus the direst and grimmest of notes. So we all always take that victory when we get it. But Ambassador Burns, this was really a wonderful discussion, and thanks for being on Brussels Sprouts. And now that you've been on once, no good deed ever goes unpunished on Brussels Sprouts. So it means you're going to have to come back.
And I will definitely come back. I'm a longtime listener. And I got to tell you, as we were speaking, I know this is going to be yesterday when people hear it. The U.S. defeated Canada 2-1 in the gold medal match. And I want to say a great match, The U.S. was behind with 2 minutes to go, and Canada played its heart out. And I hope that Canadians know how much respect we have for them.
Absolutely.
And
Great to see you both.
good to see you too,
Andrea.
Nick.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.